Canada and Australia have a lot in common. Both are resource-rich, developed nations with high living standards and similar political systems. They're also considered some of the most livable countries on Earth. But behind this surface-level similarity, their economies tell two different stories. While both nations face rising interest rates, inflation, and housing crises, Australia seems to be managing better. Economic numbers that matter. Canada's economy is slightly larger than Australia's, with a GDP of $2.2 trillion compared to $1.69 trillion in 2024. Australia performs better when considering GDP per person, with a GDP per capita of $64,400 compared to Canada's $56,500. Australia's employment situation is better than Canada's, since the unemployment rate is 3.9%, whereas Canada's is 5.8%. Australia's high employment rate strengthens economic activities by boosting consumer spending. The Australian government manages debt more effectively than Canada does because its debt-to-GDP ratio stands at 36%, while Canada's has reached 66%. In an economic crisis, Canada has limited power to accumulate additional debt. Yet Australia maintains a stronger position to handle economic challenges. The inflation situation between Australia and Canada remains consistent, with Australia at 3.4% and Canada at 3.1%. Although inflation rates are similar, Australia's stronger job market and lower debt give it a more stable economic foundation. The combination of strong indicators favors Australia in addressing financial issues better than Canada. Two resource economies. Australia and Canada rely heavily on natural resources, but their export structures create different economic models. Australia uses mining exports to generate 10% or more of its gross domestic product through iron, coal, and lithium products. Thanks to its rich mineral deposits, Australia ranks among the world's top mineral exporters, with China being its leading consumer of Australian raw materials. Throughout its economic post-World War boom, Australia has become increasingly sensitive to market price changes in global commodity markets because of its dependence on mining exports, especially for China. Within Canada, the mining sector generates 8% of GDP but remains lower than other sectors. Canada is one of the world's top oil producers, mainly due to Alberta's oil sands. Canada produces multiple mining resources, including gold, diamonds, and other minerals. Yet its economy heavily relies on significant oil sands operations. Canada faces an uncertain future regarding its dependency on fossil fuels because of the worldwide push for cleaner energy alternatives. Canada struggles to shift to clean energy because its economy relies heavily on oil sands. The agricultural sector is a standard industry since both nations are significant export markets. Australia leads wool production and stands among the leading beef exporters in the world, despite Canada's strength in wheat fields and large dairy and meat operations. While global demand boosts their agricultural sectors, both countries face challenges from climate change, such as droughts and unpredictable weather, productivity, and immigration challenges. Immigration is a primary support system for both Australia and Canada to maintain their workforce stability and economic growth. In 2022, Canada received over 430,000 immigrants, while Australia received about 400,000 immigrants in the same year. The incoming population groups are indispensable for maintaining population balance and resolving workforce deficiencies in both countries. The two countries need to solve their productivity-related problems. The simultaneous growth of GDP and population has failed to penetrate productivity levels, which remain stagnant or show a downward trend. Australia recently saw its first decline in productivity after a decade of steady growth. Yet Canada has shown some productivity growth since 2015. The slowdown of economic growth in Australia and Canada results from inadequate infrastructure development, limited investments in innovation, and challenges when integrating migrants into their labor systems. The cost of housing is an obstacle to worker relocation and creates additional strain on major city work centers. The housing crisis and its effects. Australia and Canada are in the grip of severe housing crises that extend far beyond real estate and profoundly impact economic and social well-being. Over the past 2 decades, low interest rates, underbuilding, and speculative investment have fueled a dramatic rise in home prices. In Australia, median home prices in cities like Sydney and Melbourne have crossed 1.3 million Australian dollars, with national prices rising nearly 29% between 2020 and 2022. Canada faces similar pressures. Its national average home price peaked at 816,000 Canadian dollars in early 2022 and remains high, especially in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, where prices regularly exceed 1.1 million Canadian dollars. The increased demand has intensified housing affordability problems across the market. Homes in major Australian cities cost 11 times more than local wages. Yet Canadian properties in most regions reach 9.5 times wages, with Vancouver housing priced at 13.1 times. These statistics show that home prices far exceed what average workers can afford. People need to relocate from city centers to properties with more affordable prices, which causes their commutes to become longer than 70 minutes daily in Toronto. Labor mobility suffers, along with the overall productivity output of the economy. New immigrants experience the most significant hardship because their high professional qualifications prevent them from finding places to live in major urban areas, forcing them to establish themselves in remote locations. Generational inequality is also growing. The home ownership rate for Australians between the ages of 25 and 34 fell from 60% in 1981 to 36% today. The majority of Canadian homeowners are part of older generations, while the millennial cohort lags significantly behind. This trend deepens social inequality and restricts upward movement between social classes. Governments across Canada and Australia introduced policies including foreign homebuyer restrictions, empty property fees, interest rate adjustments, and residential planning regulations. Critics describe these policies as bandages, which are ineffective solutions for the underlying problems. Future economic growth and better conditions for future generations will remain jeopardized because of insufficient construction targets, weak urban planning, and insufficient regulation on speculative housing deals. Rising interest rates and inflation pressure. In 2024, Canada and Australia implemented the most significant central bank interest rates in modern history. The benchmark interest rate at the Bank of Canada stands at 5%, but the Reserve Bank of Australia maintains its rate at 4.35%. The central banks increased interest rates to a higher level because inflation skyrocketed across the nation. High interest rate increases have led to diminished consumer spending and reduced borrowing activities. The rise in mortgage payments mainly affects Canadian homeowners because their loans have variable interest rates. Since many hold fixed-rate loans, Australian homeowners are less affected by rising mortgage rates. Their economies have endured adverse effects from high interest rates, especially within the housing sector alongside retail markets. Trade ties with China. China has become a vital yet complicated trade partner for Australia and Canada. China's rapid industrialization over the last 2 decades created massive demand for raw materials, and both nations benefited. In 2022, China accounted for over 34% of Australia's exports, mainly driven by iron ore, coal, and natural gas. For Canada, while trade with the US still dominates, China ranks its second-largest trading partner, accounting for roughly 4.3% of exports and 12.6% of imports. Australia's economic boom in the 2000s was tightly tied to Chinese demand. Mining towns expanded, job creation soared, and this boom strengthened the Australian dollar. However, this success came at the cost of diversification. When relations soured in 2020 following Australia's call for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, China responded with tariffs and bans on key exports like barley, wine, and beef. Although iron ore exports remained untouched due to China's dependency, the incident revealed the risks of relying too heavily on a single customer. Canada has also faced diplomatic tensions with Beijing. The 2018 arrest of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou sparked a diplomatic standoff, during which China detained 2 Canadians and curtailed imports of Canadian canola. Though economic ties were never entirely severed, the events pushed Canada to rethink its trade strategy. Both nations are now trying to reduce their dependency on China. Australia has signed new trade deals with India and the UK and is expanding ties with Southeast Asia. Canada, meanwhile, is prioritizing its Indo-Pacific strategy, investing in partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN nations. Still, reducing reliance on China is easier said than done. For example, Australia's iron ore exports are so central to both economies that any sudden shift could severely hurt GDP growth. A delicate balancing act emerges, enjoying the economic benefits of Chinese demand while hedging against political and strategic vulnerabilities. As global tensions rise, both countries must navigate a more fragmented and competitive international trade landscape, where economic resilience may matter as much as raw numbers. Both countries have benefited greatly from trade with China, but not without political costs. Climate change and energy transition. Climate change presents both challenges and opportunities for both Australia and Canada. Australia's per capita carbon emissions are 15.3 tons, slightly higher than Canada's 14.2 tons. Both countries face significant challenges in reducing emissions due to their heavy reliance on fossil fuels. Australia has made substantial solar and wind energy investments to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Canada, however, is more reliant on oil, sands, and fossil fuel production, making its transition to cleaner energy more difficult. Both nations are working towards reducing their carbon footprints, with Australia leading the way in solar energy installations relative to its GDP. Canada is investing in wind and hydroelectric power. Still, its large energy sector must balance maintaining its oil and gas output while transitioning to cleaner alternatives. Canada and Australia have a rich history and abundant resources, but their economic futures are headed in opposite directions. Australia benefits from increased productivity growth, a more positive attitude toward the economy, and better management of the housing and immigration issues. Meanwhile, Canada faces challenges such as dependence on the US, rising debt, and sluggish productivity. Although both nations are adapting to changes in the world, Australia is better equipped to handle economic difficulties in the years to come, thanks to its policies regarding labor market integration, fiscal policy, and resource management. Like, share, and subscribe. If you found this video helpful, let us know in the comments what these countries should do to fix their economies.